Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
The Haftarah that is set aside for tomorrow is the longest of the entire year for a Shabbat. The book of Jonah is longer, but that's for Yom Kippur and thus is able to accommodate that space. Now, our reader will only be doing one chapter tomorrow, but the entirety of it is the story of Deborah. Now, Deborah is a prophetess, and she is a judge in the time of the judges, Shoftim, as we call them. This is the period in between the leadership of Joshua, who took over after Moses had passed away, and before the establishment of the monarchy, before we had kings in Israel. During that time, the people were led by Shoftim. These were, in English we call them judges, but in English probably the better word would be chieftains. These were people that served as the leaders of their clans or collection of tribes that the people would look to for advice, for rulings, for adjudication, and in this particular case, for what to do about the rising threat of the Canaanite kingdom of Hatzor. Now, the answer was eventually go to war, and that is precisely what Deborah gave as instructions to Barak, the general, the leader of the army. And Barak said, I'll go if you go with me. I'll go if you go with me. Now, we're going to talk about his response much more tomorrow, but we have to unpack something that perhaps to you has seemed perfectly normal, so normal that you didn't even notice that it was an unusual part of the story. Who is calling the shots in this story?
The woman.
Devorah, right? Deborah. What gender is Deborah?
Female.
She's a woman. Is that okay? Can a woman be in charge of the community? Can a woman be the leader? Can a woman give orders about war and make rulings for people of who gets which territory and how to handle the peace negotiations? Is that allowed? This was a hotly contested topic. The story of Deborah has pages and pages of commentary about just that first line, that she was a prophetess. No one objected to that. Anyone can have a connection to God of such superlative power, but that she was a judge within that community that she led, and then we see her giving these instructions. Oh, there was much clutching of pearls throughout our community. Now, to be fair, they had reason to at least ask the question. Because after all, when we flip back into the Torah, we see in the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, that Moses gives some instructions with regards to the establishment of a monarchy. And Moses says, you may appoint for yourself a king. That's what he says. The rabbis later on looked at that and said, well, wait a minute. You may appoint for yourself a king. Does that mean we can't appoint for ourselves a queen? Is the fact that it uses the term king meant as gender exclusive, only men can be rulers in Israel? Or was that just the quirk of English, where sometimes we will use a masculine singular word to mean everything that might fall into that category, but Hebrew just happens to use masculine singular sometimes as a sort of categorical description? Well, the rabbis settled eventually that indeed, if we are appointing a king, that the king can only be a man, that the king can only be male. And throughout the ages, many authorities within the Jewish world pointed to this verse and said, aha, women cannot be leaders of the community, only men can be leaders of the community, because the rabbi said that's how we interpret this verse. But of course, there were many others who sat and said, how do you explain Deborah then? How do you explain the story of Deborah? If you are going to say that women can't be rulers, can't be leaders, then what do we do about Deborah, who is clearly held up as perhaps the best judge of the entire book of Judges, until we get to the very end with Eli and Samuel, who did a pretty fine job as well. But really, Deborah is the high watermark. I mean, what, we're going to compare her to Samson? Samson was a lout. He was a brute. Gideon was pretty good, but not so great, and some other little. I mean, the other judges, we're not nearly as impressive as her, and you're going to tell me her leadership was invalid, that it was inappropriate, that she should have stayed in the tent? All right, so how do the voices of our tradition reconcile this? Because I'm not going to leave you with just the argument, because there is a reconciliation within most communities. And by most, I mean Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. Most will agree on the following stipulation. Yes, according to traditional interpretation of the book of Deuteronomy, if we have a monarch, if we have a royal person, that person must be a man. That category seems to be clear from our traditional understanding of Deuteronomy. However, if they're not actually a king, they can be anyone. That when we appoint a king, we are following Deuteronomy's rule, it's going to be a guy. But when we are appointing a president, when we are appointing the chair of a corporation, when we are appointing the vice president of education within a synagogue, it can be anyone. Because there is a fundamental difference. A monarch has a certain status and authority, which is near absolute within the system. And under those circumstances, we are going to follow that precise definition of our tradition. But every other officer of the community is there because the community has chosen for them to be there. It is not a hereditary position. They will not give it automatically to their children. Their children must merit it, if at all. And it is one that is not a lifetime appointment. If you decide that the current president of the synagogue isn't right, you can change that. If you decide that the current rabbi of your community isn't right, you can change that. You don't get to do that with a king. Well, not without a whole lot more trouble. And accordingly, our tradition says we're not installing anybody when we install a woman as a king. We're just giving her the authority that we believe she deserves because she has earned it, because she has shown herself capable, and because we trust her decision and her leadership. And so too for all of the other appointments that we make, not just for women, but for men. We're not appointing kings anymore. In fact, for most of our history, we have not had kings. We are mostly shown through the book of Kings how bad kings are. Instead, Judaism sidestepped the issue of who do we appoint as an absolute monarch by saying, let's not have absolute monarchs. Let's have people who are answerable to the nation. Let's have people that we will elect or appoint or agree to by consensus to be our leaders. And that way, if they make mistakes, we can remove them without too much fuss. And if we find somebody that we like, we don't have to hesitate about who we will elevate to that position. And God forbid, we would deliberately prevent ourselves from reaching into 50% of the population to find talent and to find leadership and inspiration. So, this little line at the beginning of the story of Deborah tells us much, not just about the rights of women to be leaders within the Jewish world, but also about what it means to be a leader within the Jewish world. And whether you are aspiring to leadership or whether you are trying to choose a leader, because everybody is one or the other, if not both, remember that lesson. Shabbat Shalom.